And before we go into the Roman trials, I'm going to start off with some context leading up to that. Let's see. There we go. So we'll start with Luke 23, 1 through 5. Then the whole company of them arose and brought him before Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man misleading our nation and forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king." And Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered him, "You have said so." Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, "I find no guilt in this man." But they were urgent, saying, "He stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea, from Galilee even to this place." So, first of all, some historical context with this. At the time of Jesus' arrest, he was in Judea under Roman control, and Rome allowed for local religious courts to retain power over executions, which is why Jesus was brought to Pilate. However, the Jewish leaders could only accuse him so far. They couldn't do any executions based off of religious claims, so they really had to reframe why Jesus was being arrested, which is why if we go back to verse 3 and verse 2, we actually see asking him if he himself is Christ, a king, which is a very important understanding. They're not just referencing him as Christ, they're referencing him as a king. We see that the real accusation of the Jewish leaders against Jesus was actually blasphemous, but we see that they're reforming this sort of claim to be a king, opposing Roman authority. And that's where we see that this whole trial with the Roman authority is going to be based around this claim that Jesus is a king. So if we go to some background information, leading up to the first Roman trial, before this happens, Jesus is tried before the Sanhedrin. And we've had this conversation before in a previous lesson about the Sanhedrin, but I'll just provide a little bit of background as well, too. So the Sanhedrin was made up of religious chief priests and elders and scribes. They were able to oversee religious law and other civil matters, but they had no authority to carry out any executions at all. That was done by the Roman authority. So Jesus openly identifies as the Messiah. We see that multiple times. An example, we saw that earlier in that passage, but also in Mark 14:62. And in that specific passage in Mark 14:62, he actually intentionally quotes scripture to challenge those scribes and those Pharisees. So it's actually interesting, and we'll talk more about that in Bible class too. But it's really crucial to understand that all the people in the Sanhedrin, all the chief priests, elders, and scribes, they were claiming Jesus to be blasphemous. But the Roman authorities, they don't really care about that claim. They can't do anything with it. So we'll see sort of this movement from this claim of blasphemy to a claim of being a king and challenging Roman authority. So first of all, we'll start with the initial examination. So this is the first examination before Pilate. This is in Luke chapter 23, verses 1 through 5. And Pilate asks, "Are you the king of the Jews?" in verse 3. And if we go over to John 18, chapter 18, verses 34 through 37, Jesus responds with, My kingdom is not of this world, and his purpose is to bear witness to the truth." He's basically saying here that his power, the power of his kingdom and its principles are not from earth. So he's not challenging any of the Roman authority at all. He's saying that his power is coming from beyond earth. It's not anything to do with trying to take over Rome or challenge Rome. He's saying that it's not of earth. So that's a very clear distinction that Jesus is not trying to overthrow Rome. He's not claiming to be king of Rome. He's not doing that. He's saying his power is more than that. It's over earth. It's beyond earth. So this is where Jesus answers, basically, that alone should suffice that he's innocent. And we'll see that a lot that in these chapters and verses, that Pilate and Herod also find Jesus innocent. They have nothing against him. They say nothing, he's innocent of anything. Like, He didn't do anything wrong. But we'll go also into a little bit about some of the irregularities, the legal irregularities that Jesus faced during this trial, which led to his crucifixion. So then Jesus is sent to Herod. So Pilate seems sort of skeptical and sees Jesus as non-threatening throughout this interaction, this first sort of initial trial with him. He doesn't find any guilt in him, so he sends him to Herod, and when Pilate, in chapter 23 of Luke, verse 6, we see that Pilate heard that Jesus was a Galilean, and when he heard that, he sent Jesus to Herod because that was Herod's jurisdiction. And so something interesting is that Herod knew who Jesus was. He's heard about him, he's heard his trials, or he's heard about his miracles he's performed. So he's been wanting to see him for a long time. So when we initially get to Herod, in Luke chapter 23, verse 6 through 12, we can read that. When Pilate heard this, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. And when he learned that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent over to Herod, who himself was in Jerusalem at the time. When Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad, for he had long desired to see him, because he had heard about him, and he was hoping to see some sign done by him. So he questioned him at some length, but he made no answer. The chief priests and the scribes stood by, vehemently accusing him. And Herod, with his soldiers, treated him with contempt and mocked him. Then, arraying him in splendid clothing, he sent him back to Pilate. And Herod and Pilate became friends with each other that very day, for before this they had been at enmity with each other. So here Herod questions Jesus. Jesus remains basically silent. He doesn't really answer any of his questions because the same claims are being made that Pilate made to him. It's just a different person, and that's Herod. And so Herod sort of treats this trial as an entertainment rather than a questioning, like trying to solve the moral truth of what's going on here. We see that in verse 11 when the soldiers are treating him contempt and mocked him, and they array him in splendid clothing. And this is sort of mocking his claim of being a king, arraying him in this clothing and sending him back to Pilate. So this trial really isn't trying to solve anything. It's sort of just mocking Jesus, which sort of gives you the idea of where these trials and where these people's heads are at trying to solve this issue. So nothing's really being done. We're getting the same claims over and over again that he's this king trying to overthrow Roman authority and that he needs to be killed. So no verdict is ultimately made from this, and we actually see in chapter 23, verses 18 through 25, that he's sent back and he's put up against Barabbas. But they all cried out together, "Away with this man, and release to us Barabbas, a man who has been thrown into prison for an insurrection started in the city and for murder." Pilate addressed them once more, desiring to release Jesus, but they kept shouting, "Crucify, crucify him." A third time he said to them, "Why? What evil has he done? I have found in him no guilt deserving death. I will therefore punish and release him." But they were urgent, demanding with loud cries that he should be crucified. And their voices prevailed, so Pilate decided that their demand should be granted. He released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, for whom they asked, but he delivered Jesus over to their will. So going to the concluding trial, we see this in those chapters, also in Mark 15 and John 18, later on in those verses. We see an important statement that he makes, claiming that he finds no guilt in Jesus in Luke 23:14, and that he has nothing deserving death has been done by him. So obviously, sending him to Herod didn't work. Coming back to Pilate, he still finds no guilt. So it seems pretty obvious at this point that even though the crowds are obviously wanting to crucify him for the claims that he's made being the Messiah, the Romans can't do really anything. They don't see any challenge to authority to the Roman government. So their hands are tied and they can't do anything. Which is why, earlier when Jesus was being questioned, they were asking him whether he was a king, trying to find a way to sort of appease the legal side of it, give a reasoning and a basis for the Roman side, but also appease to the crowds wanting to crucify him. And it's interesting. So Pilate could release a prisoner because it was a Roman practice during the Passover to maintain peace. At some points, it's sort of a political move where they can offer a prisoner to release. And so Pilate actually gives Jesus a pretty good chance of being released by putting him up next to a murderer who's been thrown into prison, started insurrections, and even the crowd doesn't want that. He wants Barabbas released and wants Jesus crucified. So it sort of gives you the idea of the extent of how passionate these crowds were for wanting Jesus to be dead. And so Pilate is trying everything in his power to sort of release Jesus. He says he's not worthy of death. He says he's innocent. Herod says he's innocent. And so it's really important to understand that sort of fact. So we also see that Pilate also sent Jesus to be flogged and mocked by Roman soldiers in Luke 23:16. This was also trying another way to try to appease the crowds by punishing Jesus, but not killing him. So after this, we see that Pilate's decision. We see that Jesus remains innocent. The crowds are wanting to release Barabbas. And so ultimately, Pilate sentences under Roman law, and they claim that he is Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And King of the Jews is very important because that king title represents an opposition to the Roman authority, which gives the legal grounds for their basis. So I want to go over some Roman legal irregularities throughout this process. So there were lack of formal charges, like I've explained some bit. The Romans really wanted to have a verdict that was based on law, something that challenged their authority. And one way that was often done is by an insurrection or an uprising of a king. So in order to appeal to the crowds, they had to label him as a king, which would acquire a formal charge. We also see that witnesses were called many times to try to help bring in the formal charge. We see this in Mark 14, verses 55 through 59. Witnesses were called, and their testimonies contradicted one another, which you often see won't lead to a formal charge like this when you have witnesses contradicting each other. And we also see that his innocence was declared multiple times. So we see that in Luke 23:4, and John 18:38. Herod found no guilt. Pilate found no guilt even after a second trial. And then Pilate carried out punishments without conviction as well. Even though he was trying to find a way to not rely on the mob pressure and have Jesus crucified, he wanted to sort of appease them by, punishing him, whether it was flogging or whatever, without being found guilty. So he still punished him even though he saw him innocent, which is another irregularity. And then the last one, the reliance on mob pressure. The crowds in John 19, verse 12, this was a really important verse because they threatened treason against Pilate if they don't follow his order, or if they don't listen to them, basically. So not only is Pilate trying to give Jesus a chance to, avoid this, but also his hands are being tied because the crowd is threatening treason against him, which will basically end his career, and it could put his life in jeopardy at that point. So he ultimately decides self-preservation and releases Jesus over to the crowds to crucify him. So then I want to go over some application for this. So Jesus' kingdom is not of this world. We see that he responds to, he's beyond this world. He's beyond to the things of this world. And Pilate knew about Jesus' innocence, and even Herod saw him innocent. But instead of acting on that truth immediately, he delays on it and gives pressure to protect himself. But in contrast, we see that Jesus consistently bears witness to the truth. He openly testifies about the truth, knowing it will lead to suffering and death. We see that before in the garden when he's seeing the Roman soldiers coming down, trying to arrest him. I mean, we've talked about that a little bit too in the past. So he knows it'll lead to suffering and death, yet he still goes with it. And so this trial exposes a conflict of truth versus confidence that we can talk more about later in class, where we see that the truth calls for courage and integrity and sacrifice, while convenience offers safety, compromise, and self-preservation. We see that with Pilate and his decision that he made. So this contrast between truth and convenience, it challenges me and should challenge all of us to really examine our choices that we make, whether we allow them to control our lives, and whether we allow that fear or comfort of that convenience to shape our decisions, and whether we follow that example that Jesus set before us, where he knew what he was going through. He responded in ways that challenged people, like Jake was saying earlier, where his responses were targeted, direct, at people who knew what those answers meant. They weren't just trying to get away from it. So really shaping our decisions, we need to shape our decisions to follow the example of Jesus. And we need to choose that truth when we're in these situations. We can't choose convenience that, will let us be comfortable. It might be easy to be comfortable, but we're called more than that. So, that's all I have. So just really think about that, and we'll go over more in class about some of those, more in detail about some of those Roman trials too. So.